Good morning, good morning, good morning. I would say let us pray, but I don't intend to pray. But I'm glad to welcome David Pacini back for number 2 of 3, on Understanding Christian Nationalism, a Faithful Conversation. I also want to let you know that the transcripts of these sessions is posted or will be posted under the old-fashioned material on our website. So if by chance you miss anything that he says, it will be there for you to look at. And frankly, I encourage you to go back and listen to the podcast or read those transcripts to pick up things you might have missed during the presentation. So David, thank you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, super. I'm glad to be back. We're talking about attempts at understanding Christian nationalism, and one of the metaphors that I used, I think we've got a little bit of an echo if we can turn me down a bit. One of the metaphors that I used is problem constellation. And I wanted to say a little bit about problem constellations. A constellation, as we know, is a grouping of stars. But as you also know, people have understood those groupings of stars in different ways over time, and they change. So when we come to a problem constellation, we're really talking about moving parts, no one of which causes an understanding to arrive, but it's the interaction, the interplay amongst the parts. Now, one of the things that's tricky is that when we speak of Christian nationalism, we're speaking of very powerful ideas. And those ideas oftentimes elicit very powerful emotional responses. Conversations about Christian nationalism frequently come to ruin on the rocks of temperament. So I'm trying very hard to avoid caricatures and coming to ruin on the rocks. We'll see how well I navigate. But the fact is that one of the reasons that we get into trouble is there are different ways of reading the same things. Now, there was a philosopher, and those of you who know me know that I spend a good deal of time reading philosophy and theology and other ancient pieces of literature. This was work by a man named Wittgenstein, who taught at Cambridge. He died in 1950. He was very, very influential, probably one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. And one of the things that he was concerned about was how words have meaning. And so he was having a little difficulty with his class, and I appreciate that. That's a problem that sometimes emerges. So he decided that the best way to address that was to do a drawing. He was not a talented artist. I have here the rendering. But he pointed out that if you draw the same constellation or form and go one way, the top one looks pretty much like a duck. But if you turn it about 45 degrees, it suddenly looks very much like a rabbit. So this is called the duck-rabbit problem, and we've already encountered a little bit of the duck-rabbit problem. That's when what gets heard is not necessarily what somebody thought they were saying. So that's going to be a little issue that attends, but it's not just my sense of humor. An editorialist this week observed that the term Christian nationalism has become the new slur replacing deplorables. Now, think about that. There was a time when the term deplorables was used about a certain group of people, and it created a great deal of hostility and shame. I'm interested in the next level down. I think people become upset. I think people become worked up because something precious is at stake. And they also feel they've lost something precious. And the urge when you lose something precious is to want to replace it, to retrieve what was once the case, to restore it. We recently lost a wonderful, wonderful puppy. She's 17 and a half years old. She wouldn't exactly qualify as a puppy. But in our hearts, she was. And one of the things that we struggle with is, when is it time for the next pup? And the answer is pretty much when it can be itself and not, a replacement. Because replacements never work. You can't fill in for something that's lost. Now, that was a very safe way to get into talking about loss in the discussion about Christian nationalism. The reason that I'm using constellations is to say that this is a very, very fluid way of talking. And it has a very long history. And it's a history that is better known to us than we actually realize. For example, you all know the phrase, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. All of you know that. Well, it comes from Lord Acton. Now, what you don't know is that Lord Acton was a close friend of John Henry Newman, who went on to become a cardinal, and he succeeded Newman as the editor of the Ramparts, which was the Catholic magazine, and he was the editor who proposed and advanced libertarian economic theory and joined the idea of libertarian economics with personal piety. So that has a very credentialed stream. And during the 20s and 30s, particularly in the later 30s, economic libertarianism came to be known as Christian libertarianism. And the drive behind it goes back to Acton in some ways. There was a reservation about this newfangled New Deal thing that was running around. And the fact that people thought the government was taking over and individuals were losing ground and something precious was being lost. Now we come around the corner and I'm now on the scene because I can remember this stuff. I don't remember Acton. I mean, that was just a little bit, not much, a couple of years before I got here. But in the late 50s, or actually the early 50s, I take it back, late 40s, early 50s, Billy Graham was coming of age and many don't know this, it was part of my humor last week. He started as Presbyterian. Now, I started as Presbyterian. He went Baptist, I went Episcopalian. I don't know whether that's a good sign or a bad sign, but what that tells you is there's something about Presbyterians that causes us to keep on the lookout. So, and Billy Graham was very good at the lookout. So he formed two very important friendships. One was with a man named Fulton J. Sheen, who was a Roman Catholic bishop, who had a weekly television program in the 50s and 60s called Living the Good Life. And I remember seeing it. He also, and I didn't see this part, developed a friendship with a man named Dwight D. Eisenhower. And out of that friendship came two very important things that you know without knowing. You carry pennies. Well, you will only for a while, but you still have pennies. And on the penny it says, "In God we trust." And that was introduced by Eisenhower at the behest of Billy Graham. And Eisenhower began to call the United States a Christian nation in his public ways of speaking. And so he added to the Pledge of Allegiance, "One nation under God." I remember all these things. I was wandering around large enough to say the pledge, and in those days I could remember it. Now, sometimes little clouds come in and create a fog. But out of that grew more and more of a concern, both in Catholic circles, because now we're moving up to the 60s, and in the 60s, you have the same kind of tug of war between new programs, this was Vatican II, and traditionalism. And so that tension grows, and a lot of people who were traditional Catholics wound up becoming an ongoing expression of Christian libertarianism. So you had Paul Weirish. These were Catholics, by the way. Weirish was a Melkite Catholic. And he figured that it was really important to develop a new evangelical faith. So he needed a titular head. He wasn't much of a personable guy. So he was looking for somebody who was magnetic. And he ran into Jerry Falwell. And he suggested, well, we could have a moral majority. Falwell said, that's it. That's what we'll call the program. So you have that influence, and then you have Leo A. Leonard, also in this group, who becomes very concerned about the liberal trend in the courts. So he begins working very hard to help establish a path for more conservative justices to make their way into the system. And he served at the Heritage Foundation and also at the Federalist Society, and then formed a group called Teneos, where he was actually placing people. And he served on the Heritage Society's board that framed Project 2025. So there are all these influences, Catholic and Protestant, and there are a whole series of very conservative, Reform Presbyterians, exceedingly conservative, with names like Cornelius Van Til, and others of like ilk who had quite a gathering and following in very conservative circles, so that I learned that when our dean was having one of his moments, you see, I'm not the only one who sort of had a moment in Presbyterian land, right? So when he was having one of his moments, these guys were all part of Francis Schaeffer. These were all figures at Fuller who were very, very, very instrumental for a world that we're not entirely familiar with, but it's a very significant world. That's part of the background of Christian nationalism. And as it had succeeding generations, more and more of the proponents became intent on the need to take action to restore what had been lost. And now we come back to my comments about loss. And when somebody says that Christian nationalism is the new slur replacing deplorables, I'm more interested in what that points to in terms of a loss. What is going on that's being defended that isn't being talked about? And that's what this little series of conversations is about. You see, that it's a loss, and I will put my pudgy on it and say, it has to do with exceptionalism. Now, exceptionalism gets bandied around means lots of different things. And so today we're going to sort of take a little tour through history. Fortunately, it's a typology, so it's just a snapshot of 3 different ways. But the significance of this little typology is that Christian vocabulary, the lexicon of Christian words, was developed starting in the pre-humanist era and then really blossomed during the humanist era, which, by the way, we are heirs, okay? Anglicans, Henry decided he didn't want to be a pre-humanist. He wanted to know lots of humans very well, one wife after another. And that meant that he had to come to terms with a church that said that was not part of their ruling. So he set up his own program. And the important part is that he was a lot shrewder than we give him credit for. He got all the very important intellectual figures from around Europe to come sit with him, and Thomas More. And, I used to say to my students that they sort of had tea, and then they discussed the Reformation. Because it was a very tidy sort of thing. We're going to move this chess piece over here and that over here. And they included Calvinists, believe it. Now, that's not true. They included people who followed the teaching of Calvin. There were no Calvinists at the time that the Anglicans, that's why the Anglicans are saved. Calvinists hardened the teachings of John Calvin into a little summary slogan of beliefs about predestination and damnation and, how just dreadful you were as a human being because you were taking oxygen out of the world. And it was kind of sad stuff, but it makes a lot of sense, historically speaking, in the same way that Eisenhower makes a lot of sense, historically speaking. Eisenhower wanted to have a national Christian country because he was faced with the real threat of communism. So I want to be really clear that the responses are to very real things, and we can look back historically and make Monday morning quarterback calls. But the point was, there was the great threat. Some of you remember McCarthyism. And it was a threat that was very frightening for many, many people. And this was part of Eisenhower's response, was to develop the view that we were a Christian nation. And that view then continued under various presidents. So what was at stake was trying to preserve something that was feared, either lost or about to be lost. And the responses became pretty powerful and pretty heated. Now, I'm going to jump ahead here. There's the 2 rabbits in another form. And if you see, the one on the left looks like a rabbit, and the one on the right looks like a duck. But it's the same figure, just moved a few degrees. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that the view at the bottom of much of Christian nationalism is a retrieval of a 1950s perspective when everything, according to this picture, was hunky-dory. Unfortunately, I was alive during that period, and I can tell you that it wasn't hunky-dory, but, this has nothing to do with facts, it has to do with a construction of the mind that tells us about how things once were And if we could just return to how things once were, everything would be just fine, thank you. Because after all, we were all followers of the Puritans. Notice how incredibly 1950-ish these Puritans appear to be. But we all came from this crowd on Plymouth Rock. And we were following the great discovery of Christopher Columbus, who declared this land, a Christian land. And then we follow the great sermon of John Winthrop, a model of Christian charity. So we were all building together, and the model of Christian charity becomes, after all, the basis of It's a New Morning in America. Reagan took over this whole slogan about the city on the hill. We were a shining beacon. And that was very hopeful after there had been so much upheaval. So we were more and more taken with the idea of the city on the hill as a New Jerusalem. And eventually, we were talking about America as sort of the New Jerusalem. So it's an appropriation of Winthrop's City on the Hill. But it builds on what Eisenhower and Graham had done, and it continued through the whole succession of presidents. By the way, Kennedy had spoken about the City on the Hill. So this is not just, conservative folk of one stripe. It was a struggle to claim what was significant about America. So you have this great belief in America being the new Israel, and then we get the idea of a new covenant. So you see, we're moving into this idea of a special people, which becomes the land of Babylon, American land Babylon. We are the new Israel. And we share certain things like Jubilee, but the way we're doing it differs considerably from the Roman Catholic way of doing Jubilee. The Jubilee, for those who have forgotten, is the 7th year when sins and debts are forgiven. And it's a time of deep spiritual renewal. And we also become convinced that we're part of a new priesthood, of a chosen people. Now, you may have noticed I've been changing slides, and there's slightly different emphases in each slide. I'm very clever. I'm coming through the back door this time. Last time I walked in flat out and just said things and got myself into some interesting navigational straits. So this time, I'm just kind of working. The dean said to me, David, this is not a seminary, this is a church. And so you have to walk a lot more carefully than you did. See, the seminary, I just leaned over and they thought, he's a guy who's gonna give me an A or not an A. Of course, what you say is just wonderful. Now, the truth about that is years later, they write me these heartfelt letters about how I changed their life. I mean, this really excites me. And, and then I get to, and this is what you said. And I never said it. So there's some greater peril being in a seminary than you think, because people remember you years later for things you never did or said. Most of which I'm not sure I would say or do. Anyway, in Jubilee and in the new providential order, you have God, spouse, children, occupation, ministry. But notice what happens when you move into the more conservative version. It's Christ, husband over wife. There's scriptural mandate for these things. But what I'm really trying to say is that there are different emphases, and I want you to just keep noticing the different emphases. So we're a chosen nation. And now the question is, so what's the Great Commission? Well, for us, it's to become disciples And as my colleagues here say, and I remember Judson saying, as he smiled and winked and sort of said it probably couldn't ever work for me, that I was marked as Christ's own forever. And Judson had a great sense of humor. He knew some things would take and some things wouldn't take. So at least there was the hope that I might be marked forever. But that's actually, that's the commission, but it's also the exception, you see. That's how we're set apart. Now, that's very different from the idea of manifest destiny. This is an actual painting that you can see if you go out to Santa Fe. It's in the Santa Fe Historical Museum. And it was this idea of how we were commissioned to take over the land and drive out the peoples and claim all this for ourselves. So, I've given you a little exercise in which you get the sense of how the same words can have different emphases. Now I'm going to give you a quick run through of where we got some of these things. The pre-humanist, that's fairly simple. This is Constantine, and you will be told that Constantine, made Rome Christian, which is not at all true. What really happened was he made a bet that he lost, which was, if I do these things, I'll sort of go along with you. And the question was, would he win the battle? Well, he won the battle, so he said, okay, I'll do that. But what he did was recognize Christianity as one amongst the many religions in Rome. That's huge. It meant that you were no longer guaranteed to be breakfast for lions. You've heard of breakfast for champions. Well, this was breakfast for lions. And Ignatius of Antioch writes boldly as he's going to his death. This was common practice. But once you made Christianity part of the religions, it wasn't long before it became the religion, and that was under the Emperor Theodosius. And this is in Hagia Sophia, the great church in Constantinople. And only the emperor goes through this entrance to see this, but it's Theodosius bowing before Christ, the King of Kings. And so what happens is the empire becomes Christian. Now, let's just get honest about it. It becomes all Christian unless you're an Arian. Now, Arians were also Christians, but they lost at the Council of Nicaea. And going to the school that I went to, it's a little bit up the river, in one of those cities with shining beacons and everything else, I was taught that at the end of Nicaea, that was it, and the Nicene Party won. Imagine my shock when I arrived in the Middle East about 25 years ago. And there are Arian churches all over the place. So the first thing is, just because we think we've vanquished somebody, it's not necessarily so. But the second thing is, notice how the narrative suggested that this was the enemy, and those people were no longer part. So we have this little tension built in to our imperial sensibilities that we carry over from this pre-humanist era. Now I'm going to skip forward and just say that this imperialist attitude led to the First Crusade. The First Crusade was done under Urban, and Peter the Hermit, who was a great preacher and who finally got the troops rallied at the Garden of Gethsemane, and they went out and they won, and they set up 3 fiefdoms that went for hundreds of years. But this was not exactly a happy thing for a lot of people. But it settled pretty clearly the idea of the imperial presence in Christendom. Now, when Peter was preaching, one of his favorite things was Deus volet. God wills this, God wills this, God wills this. That phrase, Deus volet, has occurred again in more recent times in uprisings against established order. So this is part of our inheritance. As Peter the Hermit preaching, we don't need to do too much more on that. The main point was that God was understood here as the ruler of all things, Pantokratos. And the Christian was the warrior, the knight. And increasingly, you see, Christ was understood as God. God is perfect. God is not affected by anything. So this is a Byzantine crucifix. I'm always fond of showing this. I used to say to my students, it's as if, every hour or so, Jesus gets off the cross, goes out, takes a coffee break, and then comes on back, and just kind of hangs around. Because notice, he's holding up the cross. It's very interesting. Now, this is going to go through some pretty significant changes, but exceptionalism here means the right to take over other religions and other countries. It also means that we're better than the animals. That's we're set apart and we're to have dominion. Now, that little word comes back, dominion theology, takes its beginnings from this particular idea. Now we move to the humanists. And the humanists, in one sense, are an accident. They're an accident that starts because of the Fourth Crusade. And Innocent III doesn't do real well at getting people involved. He has to rely on mercenaries. And mercenaries, as you may or may not know, you can imagine, and they're not entirely reliable. One village looks like the next village, and if the idea is go in and pillage, then you go in and pillage, and who cares which city it is, which is exactly what happened, except the city was not Jerusalem, the city was Constantinople, which was a Christian city, which did not sit well with the Christians in Constantinople, I think. This is a very famous depiction of the conquest of Constantinople, and another one, the Fourth Crusade. Well, that led to the need to establish some peace between East and West. So Pope Martin convened the Council of Florence. Now, why have I taken you through all this? Well, because an accident happens at the Council of Florence. A guy by the name of Cosimo de' Medici. You've heard of the Medicis. They made their money as apothecaries. They made, that's what the medicine men were. He was a doctor, but he just either bled you to death or he, fed you more chemicals to death, but it was what you did. So he runs into a guy by the name of Gemistos Plethon, who tells him that there are these Florentines. Well, they're not Florentines. They're known as Neoplatonists, and Pico della Mirandola, and Ficino, and this little group. And for whatever reason, this really struck Medici as a great idea. So Cosimo brings them all to Rome. Very famous painting in the bottom of Raphael's School of Athens. He's got the humanists, Ficino, Landino, Poliziano, Caracciolo, as a sort of a footnote. But he also starts gathering not just philosophers, but artists. So a guy by the name of Cimabue, who brings along his student Giotto. And then we begin to see, here's the Byzantine. Remember the Byzantine? All right. This is what happens. This is the real way to see humanism. All of a sudden, Jesus starts to become human. The body is more. So this is the Cimabue crucifix. Watch what happens now when we get to Giotto, who was his student. It's unbelievable. It's just extraordinary. I stood watching, staring, absorbed, completely taken with this crucifix, until my sons came in and said, not Giotto, gelato. It's time for gelato. So I had to get up and leave because the kids wanted gelato. And anyway, that ended my little reverie with Giotto. It went on. This was a wonderful crucifix by Donatello. This is 1409. Notice that it's becoming more and more human. And then this amazing thing happens. Donatello gets into sort of a, braggadocio moment. So he says to his buddy, Brunelleschi's the guy who did St. Mark's. Now, if you know anything about the dome, the fascinating thing is it's built entirely from the inside, not from the outside. First time it's ever been done. So he's an architect, but all these guys did everything. So Donatello's saying, da-na-na-na-na, to Brunelleschi. And Brunelleschi says, well, why don't you drop by, tomorrow at my shop? So he does. And he'd brought some wine and bread. He was a good Episcopalian. And he walked in, and he dropped the wine. And he just said, I've never seen anything like this. The Brunelleschi crucifix is just extraordinary. And it's followed then by Michelangelo's crucifix. So you see this movement to more and more humanizing, all right? And then, of course, David, and then the great symbol, Da Vinci's, Vitruvian Man. So what's happened here, and you've watched, is the human has now taken center place. And then the Enlightenment takes over, and the Enlightenment starts talking about, being able to control nature. Well, how do you do that? Because you know what the laws of nature are. Francis Bacon says, we will throw nature into the dark and wrest from her secrets. Okay, so you've got this sense of dominion over nature and its rules. And then you have this extraordinary business of new systems of classification. That's the way to understand the Enlightenment. You start with Linnaeus, and you have Gulliver's Travels. You have Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and, by the way, there's a second volume, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. For those of you who don't know, he thought the two went together. Reagan and some others just thought supply side was enough, so they took volume 1 and skipped volume 2, which was the sense of fellow feeling so you wouldn't beat somebody else up. It was the beginning of great philosophical inquiry, David Hume, Montesquieu's Principles, and of course Kant. Anybody who's hung around me knows that the all-crushing Kant sort of ate me for breakfast a long time ago, and I've never really escaped the grips. But it wasn't all that kind of cold rationalism. There was a counter movement of pietism with Hermann Frank, and you have Schleiermacher's speeches. You have Rudolf Otto's idea of the holy. You have the Pia Desiderata by Spener. And the whole point here was a tension, and Hermann's, the Christian's communion with God. The whole idea here was that this was a matter of the heart, not just a matter of the head. So now you have these two things coming together. You get the production side of things in society, the printing press, the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, the invention of geological. So what's the great example of this? Well, if the First Crusade was the example for pre-humanism, the British Museum is the example for the Enlightenment. And very simply, they brought together artifacts from all over the world and figured out ways to classify them. They recreated this exhibit back for the 100th anniversary, and I happened to be there. And the most astonishing thing about it was that they didn't know what to do with shoes. So they had to brought in a guy who had studied Linnaeus to figure out what to do, whether they're going to do it by material, whether they're going to do it by size, and they finally figured function. Okay, so what you have in the humanist is this gathering of knowledge and the power of knowledge and the sense of universal wisdom and knowledge of how the universe worked. And the post-humanists come along and say, look, the Vitruvian Man and the British Museum are sort of misleading because they suggest something that's not true. They suggest a kind of cohesiveness and universalism that's not true. And it's very subtle because what's universal is what looks like the guys who were writing the books, Diderot and, Kant. These were basically white men. And their whole idea about women and people of other cultures was, for the most part, limited. That's the kindest thing I can say. They were downright classist and sexist and misogynist and all the rest of this. So what you see is that just below the surface of this great connectedness of the Enlightenment is profound fragmentation and disconnectedness. So the symbol, and there's not really one for post-humanism, but the one that we can talk about briefly is the cyborg, which is this putting together. It's an image of the technological parts that are being put into human beings, which signals a departure from the way in which the Enlightenment and humanists thought about humans. So now we have this little typology comes to roost, and we have a couple more minutes, and I'll finish what I'm going to say for today. The pre-humanist is imperial, and it poses the humanist and ecological awareness. It trades on what I call methodological negation. In other words, it discovers that hidden in the universals of the Enlightenment are the negation of a lot of others. So then the argument becomes it's the negation of otherness. And that's sort of the rallying cry. So what you get in essence is a whole lot of cultural relativism. Different people say, this is my truth, this is my truth, this is my truth. And the problem is, how does it all get together? So now we have the exceptionalism of pre-humanism is the imperialist conquering warrior who can take over. And we still sing about it, onward Christian soldiers. I mean, don't think I'm just giving you a history lesson that you haven't heard about. You sing about it, all right? And when you get to the Enlightenment, we sing praises for all things bright and beautiful. Everything comes together in that ecological awareness of post-humanism. We have all this hymnology that feeds subtly our awareness of these themes. But what's going on in the emphases of what we're calling Christian nationalism, this coming together of different constellations, is a negation of humanism, a negation of ecological awareness, the real reservations about the expansion of digital technologies, and real concern about privileging any one group over another. And so what we have is three different kinds of exceptionalism that come into conflict, and we carry all of those inside of ourselves. So the point that I made last week is that nationalism, Christian nationalism, makes us uncomfortable. This week I'm going to say it makes us uncomfortable because it brings us face to face with our uncertainty about our own exceptionalism. Where do we fit in that whole picture? Because we've grown up with it. And where do we fit specifically as people of faith? So that's the challenge at this point, and I give to George now the question period.
No, thank you very much. We've got 35 seconds for questions.
Boy, I like that. That's the best deal I've ever had.
Seriously, it is 11 o'clock. If you need to pick up kids from Godly Play, please, you have our permission to do that. If you'd like to stay for a minute and ask David questions, I think you have time to stay.
Sure,
yes?
absolutely.
So I would like you to use the microphone to answer questions because there are a large number of people listening to the podcast. It's better for them if they can hear the question clearly. With that said, here you go.
Thank you so much, Professor. I really want to ask a question I wanted to pose last week. We ran out of time, and you had mentioned that Christian nationalists leaned more towards a Hebraic understanding of, I want to say, divinity or scripture. I just wondered if you could flesh that out a little bit.
Law. The importance of applying biblical law to everyday practices. So interestingly, you get a lot more recitation in the materials that the folks that I cited have written on the Hebrew Bible, where there's a great deal more exacting instruction about what you're to do in different cases. So the idea of the patriarchal family comes out of parts of the Hebrew Bible. It's not all of it, but it's biblically based. But it's really about the application of law. The problem, it's Judeo-Christian, but it's called Christian. It's a very interesting kind of application. The principal point is that we lost our way because we're not following biblically based laws in the ordinary role of our governance and interactions with each other in our country. That's the argument.
So you said that communism caused Eisenhower, or the threat of communism caused Eisenhower to push the idea of a Christian
It contributed
nation.
to it. I don't want to overstate it, but it
no,
contributed.
I get it. So what role do you think the spread of Islam in the United States has played in the development of Christian nationalism?
I think the fear of the other, we don't know enough. This is a family religion. It's the Abrahamic religions. Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all have the same Abrahamic roots, Abraham. Islam is very complicated because it's got lots of divisions. The Sunni and the Shiite don't get along. They have very different views. So I think it's the fear of the other, and I think that was jacked up a lot by 9/11. And so we've developed a whole way of talking about, and the laws that came into effect at that point about how you could retain people without rights, people who lived in Guantanamo for a long time. That, I think, represents our fear of the other. I would just, from a philosophical, theological point of view, I want to push, it's the anxiety about otherness. So then you begin to understand that the affirmation of people that look like me is what we'll talk about next week, what Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone says is bonding. We don't bridge with other people, we bond with like, and we huddle together. There was a picture in my grandfather's home that I will never forget. You came down the steps, and here was this little cluster of Shetland ponies all huddling together in a snowstorm, right? And just in the back was a barn with a light. But they were so busy holding on to themselves, trying to stay warm, that they missed the barn. It's kind of like what I say about Methodists. Every Thanksgiving I go down to where John Wesley preached and had his church. It's Christ Episcopal Church. And I delight in telling all of my students that Wesley was never a Methodist. Oh, it's such a painful thing. And then they put this little retreat center just next to the church but you can't see it because they put a whole forest in there. So I said, well, Methodists cannot see the forest for the trees. So,
Yeah, hi.
hi.
Question, this has also a reference to last week.
Sure.
And I just need some clarification. I'm sure I don't ever want to quote you wrongly or whatever. But it had to do with your comments about the Nicene Creed, which to me is pretty fundamental to our beliefs. And you called it, you used the word symbolism.
Yeah, it's a symbol.
And some priests, writing poetry. And
Okay.
to people like, well, to me anyway, to me that's the whole reason our feeling is Christians. And
Yeah,
the Trinity and everything.
I want to be really clear that I was not making light. The term symbol was the word that the people who put that creed together used for it. It was called the symbol. It meant this is the way that we are speaking of that for which there are no words. They were not literalists. The Cappadocians and the Nicene Fathers worked very hard to maintain the mystery of God and the mystery of the relationship. Over time, we've tried to literalize it. I understand that. It is absolutely essential, but it's essential as a symbolic expression of our willingness to stand as a people in the face of the unknown, not as a warranty that, okay, we got the inside track. That's a kind of exceptionalism. I'm talking about a different kind of exceptionalism, our faith, which says that we're not afraid as a people to face the unknown in faith rather than knowledge. There's a subtle thing that happens where we try to turn the symbolism and poetic expression of the creed into a literal set of words. So that was what I was trying to get. Does that help? It's not a question of wrong. It's a question of, historically speaking, what did they think they were doing? So in this case, I'm a little bit of, George is going to kill me, an originalist. What they thought they were doing and what the debates were about was finding the best poesis means layering of language to yield something that ordinary language can't yield. That's what they thought they were doing. And that I think is the genius of it.
Right, so we invite you to session 4, where he'll be describing originalism. But in the interim, Bill, you have a question, and then Martin, and that's probably it.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm getting the negation, the methodological negation of the elements you're talking here. The one I'm still confused on is why are they negating the expansion of digital technologies? Because I figured that would be
because because it calls into question the human subject. Artificial intelligence. I mean, one of my colleagues decided to put it to me this week and said, I want you to respond to these questions. Which one was written by a real person and which one was written by a machine? And because I'd said that the point is that nobody could duplicate affect. And I lost. I couldn't tell which was which. My wife said, you need to take a few more poetry lessons and you'll know exactly which is which. The crucial point is that methodological negation works as a principle, which is my term. No one's wandering around. It's just if you sit and study it, that's what's happening. So that's the advantage of being a guy who sits around all day and looks at these things. Or the disadvantage. You start looking at these things all day long, you start becoming methodological negation yourself. But it's an approach that sees deeply that there's a flaw in the claims of universal control, of knowledge, of classification, of nature. Nature's running wild. And the fear amongst the critics is that not only is nature running wild, but technology is running wild, because it's not a respecter of what a human subject is. And that's key to nationalism, is the subject is the one who's created in the image of God, period.
to last week as well as today. And the subject matter being Christian nationalism. And you said today it's often used as a slur, and it is. And I'd like you
By
to
some people, yes.
define today Christian nationalism versus Christian patriotism.
Well, Christian patriotism are Christians who put the cross and God first and the country second. And Christian nationalists put the Constitution and the country first, and then they organize their thoughts about religion around that. And they do so on the grounds of conflating documents that were never completed. The Constitution was not written with the Bible in hand. The Declaration of Independence was not written with Bible in hand, and not all of the people who were involved in writing the Constitution or the Declaration were Christians. There were deists, there were agnostics. So it's a way of reading. It's a concept. I've called it a problem constellation, a way of putting things together. But the clear distinction between the two is, if we're talking about Christian patriotism, we're talking about people who put God and Christ first and country second. If we're talking about Christian nationalism, we start with the principles of a country which governs the way in which Bible and theological arguments are interpreted.
Well, the Constitution is very clear.
Good. Beg your pardon?
They want to separate church and state.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Right.
So my question is, explain to us who they are Christian nationalism, who they are Christian patriotism.
Well, the they of the Christian nationalists are Cornelius Van Til, Francis Schaeffer, W.C. Parker, the principal writers who have maintained this, including the New Apostolic Reformation, the leader of that group. So they're very explicit about it, that this was ordained by God and carried out by God and everything else. So it's that specific group. Now, those are authors, so I can attribute their writings. We don't have to, it's not debatable whether they've said this. In other words, I'm not sort of freewheeling interpretation. I've tried really hard to be very clear. And the people who defend this are very clear that they are speaking what they consider to be truth. So I've tried to respect the fact that they consider that to be truth. I would say Christian patriots are probably the majority of the people in this room who take their Christianity very seriously and try to live those principles in and how they live with others in the country, but they're not trying to turn the country into a Christian nation. I think that's what. Right. I agree, but that doesn't mean that there aren't those who would like to see that. That's what Project 2025 is about, is the establishment of essentially a Christian nation following the principles as they understand what a Christian nation would look like. Okay.
Well, next week.
Yeah, next week.
Next week's another opportunity. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.